now it's time to invite Azam Alwash, the Iraqi ecologist, nature conservation activist, and co-founder of the American Institute in Iraq, but also one who initiated largely and made it possible that restoration of the drained Mesopotamian marshes was possible. And as an acknowledgement of these efforts, he was awarded the Goldman Prize, so-called Green Nobel Prize. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation. It is an honor to have you in our meeting, and please share your thoughts about the restoration potential of the Iraqi marshes.
Let's see if I can share the keynote. Can you see the keynotes here?
Actually,
yes.
All right, wonderful. So this is a schematic of Iraq. The Tigris and Euphrates being the main feeders of southern Iraq. What people watching this need to understand is that the marshes of southern Iraq are essentially a natural retention basin. The water, 90% of the water of the Euphrates comes in from the mountains of Kurdistan, which is a mythical state that is shared currently by Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. The Tigris and Euphrates, so southern Iraq is a sedimentary plain. The word sedimentary implies that the soil came from somewhere and deposited or settled out of sediment of water. You look at the map and you can see that the source of the soil of southern Iraq, the sedimentary plain of southern Iraq, is actually the mountains separating Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, or otherwise known as Kurdistan. So what I like to tell people in Iraq when I'm giving a lecture about the marshes is that the connection between southern Iraq and the mountains of Kurdistan is intrinsic, and it precedes humanity. So the soil of southern Iraq comes in from the mountains, and the water of southern Iraq comes in from the mountains. The nature is continuous. Nature has no passport. Nature does not recognize the political boundaries that have been placed artificially by mankind. That said, the function of the marshes are essentially a natural retention basin. 60-70% of the water of the Tigris and Euphrates comes in during the flood, which is basically in the spring. In the coming month, in March and April, is when the snow starts melting in the mountains of Kurdistan, bringing the source of water, bringing the water and the sediments from the mountains down to southern Iraq. It all wants to get to the Gulf, but there's only a small hose called Shatt al-Arab. It's a huge river. It's a navigable river. However, it is not capable of taking all the water out at once. So essentially what happens is that you have a wetlands in southern Iraq that essentially contains the water and holds the water well into the summer. And that is the cycle of life that created the incredible island of biodiversity in the middle of a desert. Iraq, without these two rivers, will be as dry as Kuwait is, as Saudi Arabia, as southern Iran, and as Jordan is. The water world that has created in southern Iraq is the result of that, is the gift of the Tigris and Euphrates and the Karun and the Karkha. And if you go back to biblical texts that Hans alluded to, you will know that Eden was fed by 4 rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates and Karun and Karkha actually feed these marshes. So many biblical scientists indicate that southern Iraq is the original Eden, or at least what the Sumerians was referring to as the first creation. Mankind used to live in hunter-gatherer form, but the very first cities that were built and permanently established were in the shores of these marshes. Why is that? It is because the land is in fact lower than the water. It is the only place, or one of the few places on earth, where you can actually move the water by gravity. Nile has a delta, but the delta of the Nile is higher than the river. So the Egyptians, which developed agriculture 500 years after the Iraqi Sumerians, of southern Iraq, is the key to why why southern Iraq is the cradle of Western civilization. Irrigated agriculture is made possible by the fact that we can move the water using gravity. The problem with irrigation or flood irrigation is that because of the fact that the soil is completely saturated, the salts in the soil comes up to the surface, and then the water evaporates, leaving salts behind. And there is a term called in Sumerian called sabkha, and it's now a geological term indicating the effervescence of the soil. So the floods is what has made irrigated agriculture continuous in this land for the last 8,000 years. The water comes in, it washes away the salt, deposits a new layer of silt and clay, renewing the vitality. And that's why mankind established the very first cities around the edges of the marshes where they permanently inhabited. This is a picture that shows you the location of dams and irrigation structures that have been built on the Tigris and Euphrates and the tributaries feeding southern Iraq. And you can see that mankind has tried to master nature and essentially protected the cities against floods. But as a result of this, in fact, the Iraqi engineers have been causing the slow death of irrigated agriculture in the farmlands of southern Iraq. Because what is happening last 40, 50 years is the fact that the flood cycle has been interrupted as a result of all of these structures. Here's a hydrograph of the Euphrates River in Hindiya. Hindiya is a town just to the north of Najaf. And essentially you can see the pulse of flood that has made irrigated agriculture continuous and made the biodiversity of the marshes possible. See, the marshes need this. The biodiversity of the marshes was dependent on this pulse to continue to be alive. And the pulse was all good until about 1975. This is about 1975. You can see the first hicks, and that's when Syria and Turkey built their first dams on the headwaters of the Euphrates. The pulse came back again, but not as strong after 1975. And you can see that beginning in 1990, the pulse was interrupted, and now it's almost flat. That heartbeat, that drum beat of the biodiversity symphony is being interrupted and basically being toned down. We have a lot more water in the summer than we used to before, but we don't have that pulse that cleansed the farmlands. The same story you can see on the hydrograph of the Tigris. Again, the symphony was loud. Back in 1954, it kind of stopped because, in fact, Iraq built something called the Samarra Barrage and started transferring the flood water into a big depression called the Thirthar Depression. But there was a pulse, and then beginning in the 1990s, the pulse died because of the dams being built upstream in Turkey, holding the water of the flood. What is the result of that? The result of that is that the biodiversity is changing. The marshes have been not restored. I don't use the word restored when I describe the marshes of today. I say the marshes have been reflooded because of the fact that the pulse of flood has in fact stopped. The biodiversity is changing because there were some species that actually needed that pulse of flood to continue to exist in large numbers, and they no longer can. And so, biodiversity is changing. But ladies and gentlemen, the only constant in nature is change. These marshes will continue to exist, whether in their form of brackish water. They used to be sweetwater marshes, now they're brackish water marshes. But there is a big danger over the horizon called climate change. Climate change is causing the sea level to rise. And this is one model that shows a moderate scenario of seawater rising 3 meters. You can see that the marshes will become seawater marshes if we don't do anything about climate change worldwide. This is not an Iraqi problem, this is a worldwide problem. But more specifically, this is a problem for southern Iraq, where over 6 million people, maybe 7 million people are living today. If their cities are flooded, guess what's going to happen? You think Victor described to you the migration problem that they saw last winter and the last 3, 4, 6 months ago. Well, that's a prova, a picnic compared to what's going to happen if we don't do anything about climate change. Add to that the fact that Iraq today is 41 million people. It is increasing by 1 million person a year. So by the year 2030, we'll be 51, 52 million people. By the year 2050, we'll be 80 million if we continue increasing in numbers the way we are right now. And on top of that, our entire economy is built on extracting oil and exporting it. As the world leaves oil behind, what is going to happen to Iraq? Iraq's economy is going to crash. Southern Iraq is losing agricultural land due to flooding and due to outdated irrigation methods. And the income is going to be decreasing from oil. This is what I call a perfect storm. 3 different storms, in fact, hitting Iraq about the same time in over the horizon 10 to 15 years. And well before Southern Iraq becomes seawater inundated, it is going to be basically exporting all these migrants. And if you think that these migrants are going to go to China or India, you would be wrong. I think they would be heading mostly towards Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, just like as refugees used to do in the 80s and 1990s. So the marshes have been restored. The marshes will continue to exist. By the way, reeds can grow in seawater. So I have no worries about the continuation of the marshes. What I worry about is the fact that what we are facing is not a crisis. What we are facing is water bankruptcy. Crisis means that it's a problem that we can weather and then it will go away. Well, I think Iraq is not facing a crisis. Iraq is facing bankruptcy. So I am going to go back to my video. I'm gonna talk to you about solutions. I don't want to leave you with a sense of danger and no hope. I want to tell you that in this bankruptcy is not only facing Iraq, but it's also facing Iran, facing Saudi, facing Kuwait. Kuwait has enough money for the future generations because they have been wise in saving the oil wealth. Saudi has a $700 billion trust that they can work on. But Iraq has nothing. Iraq is bankrupt even as we speak, financially speaking, because of the wars that we have been going through since 1980. On top of that, the fact is we are losing all sorts of water due to irrigation or flood control structures that were built around the idea that we have more water than we need. And while that was true until 1997, we had more water than we knew what to do with. It is no longer the case. Unfortunately, all the water is being held now by Turkey and Iran. We used to get 15 billion cubic meters of water from Iran annually. Today we get zero, nothing, because Iran is suffering from the same problem that we are suffering from. They have 80 billion people, and they need all the water they can get. And so, what I have suggested, and what the president of Iraq has in fact endorsed, and he issued something called the Mesopotamian Revitalization Initiative, which is basically a set of ideas on which we can build a different model of our economy, both in Iraq and regionally. Iraq has been the battleground between Iran and Saudi, between Iran and the United States, and both of them, and actually Turkey, all of them are vying for control, political and economical, and it's a zero-sum game that has been going on for 40 years. We need to change that dynamic to having all the countries in the region having a stake into stabilizing Iraq. And it comes, in my opinion, through the management of water. The dams in Turkey are going to be continuously used for the next 100, 150 years until the reservoirs are filled with that sediment that created southern Iraq. So for the next 100, 150 years, what we need to do is convince Iraq and Turkey to cooperate on the management of the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. How can that be? Iraq today loses 8 billion cubic meters of water due to evaporation from outdated flood control structures. The Thirthar Lake that I told you about in 1954 that began being filled with water to protect Baghdad against flooding, by itself is 3,400 square kilometers in size. You multiply that by 3 meters of evaporation from the Thirthar Lake. By itself, we're actually losing 7.5 billion cubic meters of water a year. That's a heck of a lot of water that can keep all of Iraqi farms irrigated if we actually manage it properly. And so what I am telling Iraqis to do is, in fact, convert their management structure of the floods to cooperation with Turkey on the management of the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. We can rent Turkish infrastructure, Turkish dams to store water for Iraq. And the cost of leasing is not going to be paid by dollars, but it's going to be paid by giving access to the southern border of Iraq to Turkish goods. If we have transit rights, Turkey can benefit from reaching its products all the way to the Gulf. And those trucks that are bringing Turkish goods back to the Gulf can then come back loaded with Chinese goods, whatever goods, basically going back to Poland and Germany. On top of that, what I would suggest to the Iraqi engineers is that what Iraq needs is electricity. We can actually purchase the electricity from all the hydroelectric dams that Turkey has built. What do we pay for the electricity with? Well, we can deliver gas that we're currently burning or oil to Istanbul. And if we have reached Istanbul with our gas, we can actually certainly 150 kilometers will go to Bulgaria, and from Bulgaria to Poland, and access Berlin. I mean, right now you're all talking about Russia attacking Ukraine, and everybody's worried about the gas supplies to Germany. Well, there is a very nice solution here, is to transport gas from Basra all the way to Eastern Europe using gas lines. Now, I don't want to get into I know everybody's going to say nobody's going to allow it. I'm going to tell you that the economy of the idea makes sense to everybody. The political situation is what is not possible.
I didn't expect, Azam, that we would step on such a high political agenda during this meeting, but who knows?
Well, I can tell you that a photovoltaic cell installed in southern Iraq costs the same as a photovoltaic cell installed in Poland. $100, let's say, a photovoltaic cell. But the production of the photovoltaic energy in Poland is 1/3 of that of Iraq. In Poland, you'll be producing 120 to 130 days a year. The same photovoltaic cell will be producing for 330 days a year. That's 3 times the production for the same cost. So what I'm suggesting is not building photovoltaic farms in Iraq, but I want to build photovoltaic cells in Iran and in Saudi and have them export their extra electricity using Iraq all the way to Turkey. And once we reach Turkey, we have reached Europe. In other words, have Iran and Saudi Arabia have an interest, and Turkey have an interest in stabilizing the economy of Iraq, because in fact, when everything is working together, we will have an incentive for the capital to stabilize the area. Meanwhile, I can actually also connect Basra to Berlin through Budapest and Baghdad, and that landline that already exists. What I'm talking here about is actually ideas to connect the economies of the 3 major countries in this region: Saudi, Iraq, Iran, and then of course add to that Turkey. If we actually understand that the zero-sum game that they are playing is in fact going to not lead to any place except the kind of destruction that faced Europe after World War II, then we can possibly have an incentive to create a cooperative economy the way Europe has done after World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union started with one simple idea. In 1950, May of 1950, Germany and France coordinated together or created a coordination agreement of the production of steel and coal. 5 years after, these 2 countries were at each other's throats, killing each other. But what happened after World War II is both countries' economy was destroyed because of the war. Of course, England's economy was destroyed after that war. And it was in their economic interest to cooperate together for the benefit of their children, of the people of these countries. 5 years later, or actually 7 years later, 1957, the coordination agreement between France and Germany became the Steel and Coal Union between 6 countries that were in fact fighting each other in World War II. And then 5 years after that, they created the Common Agricultural Market of Europe. Well, do we need 2 world wars here to understand that the zero-sum game does not work? I don't know. All I can tell you is that these ideas have been embraced by the government of Iraq at the highest levels, and we can start locally. We already started with photovoltaic plants. We already started. And then you got to say, what does this benefit the marshes? I can tell you that the way I want to feed the marshes is in fact, if we reach an agreement on the management of the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates together with Turkey. What we can do is just about January and February, we will know by monitoring the thickness of the snow in the mountains, how much water is going to come from the snow melt. So what we should do is prepare the infrastructure of Turkey to receive that snow melt. So what they should do is be basically in January and February, be releasing a lot of water. And in fact, that water should go towards the marshes because we're not going to be able to use it for irrigation in the winter. And that way we can create a mechanical flood for the refugee of the marshes to continue to exist. And as long as there are about 750,000 Iraqis right now dependent on the marshes for their livelihood, then that is the reason why we need to have the water in the marshes. We need to give Iraqi farmers and Iraqi Ma'dan a possibility to continue their old way of life that lasted the Sumerians. And I'll end it at that. I think that's enough talking, but I can tell you, visit the presidency site of the president of Iraq, and you will see you can download the Mesopotamian Revitalization Initiative of the president, and you can see what I'm talking about.
Thank you very much, Azam. I hope, yes, we can see you now. I was surprised that you started connecting wetlands and water. That was not the surprise, but then oil and gas. But actually, this is very important to show that everything is connected, and everything is connected to the economy and then to the politics, and that shows the importance of wetlands in this context. Yes. So.
I mean, look, the photovoltaic. The world is leaving oil behind. Today, the demand on oil is about 95 to 85 million barrels a day of oil. And the world, the last internal combustion engine that is going to be sold in Europe and in America is about 2030, maybe 2028. I mean, that's 5-6 years down the line. So the models or the economists that I talk to are predicting that the demand of oil is going to go down from 95 million barrels a day today to about 25 million barrels a day in 2050. We're not going to go to zero. There's still going to be a demand for oil. And you can continue producing oil, but that even if they produce the 25 million barrels, it's not going to be enough. That's not enough money. But what we can do is go to the original source. I talked to you about photovoltaic. We can produce photovoltaic energy in southern Iraq. It's a desert. I mean, we have lots of sunlight. So the extra electricity that we're not selling, we're incapable of selling during the day, what we can do is use it to generate hydrogen from the Gulf water. That's green hydrogen. And the world is going to green hydrogen. The infrastructure that we can build today to transfer natural gas that I'm supposing we can produce to Europe is a transitional gas. Eventually, we are going to be trading with hydrogen, with green hydrogen. And so, in fact, Iraq can produce, or doesn't have to produce. Iran can produce the hydrogen. Saudi Arabia can produce the hydrogen. But Iraq is the major structure that, or pathway to Europe. Look, Iraq's history is built on two things. It is the breadbasket for this region, but it's also a major stop in the Silk Route, east-west, north-south. We are geographically located at a very, very important. Empires did not compete to control Iraq because we're beautiful. I mean, yes, we are beautiful, but we are a geostrategic asset. We have food, we have an incredible important location as far as geography is concerned, And that's why we have been competed on by the Persians, by the Ottomans, and after that by the British. This is an important area. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the blueprint to the future of Iraq is in fact embedded in its history as a food basket, as a Silk Route station. Okay, but on top of that, we can continue producing energy because we have sunlight. You don't have it. You beg for it.
Somewhat
during the
less,
summer.
or more diversified.
And so what we can do is, but it's all based on the economy. The world is based on economy. We've been talking about reducing oil dependence, but people are refusing to do that because nobody wants to be discomforted. But right now we're being forced to. So I'm suggesting to you is that the future, that this danger, this bankruptcy is not only facing Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, but it's facing us all of us.
Yes,
To work together to. This is actually a catalyst for a better future. So instead of competing with each other and who's going to win, let's work together and just let's live together.
After all, the global economy and the global politics is also the zero-sum game. We'll get back to the game theory in wetland or river management with the talk of Kaveh Madani. So that will be the next one, not the nearest one, the next one. Now still Salman Haraila. Yes, do you have a question to Assam?
Sure. I would like to stress one thing that you said, that people in Iraq, you used to think that you have more water than you need. And it was before the first dam was built in 1975, right? And I think it should be like warning for every society who thinks that they have too much water. Like when people think that they have too much water, they should be warned, because you cannot fight the water. You have to just use it reasonably.
This exemplifies what happens everywhere actually with draining wetlands, and we have the same in Poland actually.
And we are still on the level of thinking that we have too much water and we have to fight it. And this is like really sad.
In Iraq, 80%, 92% of the water of Iraq is used for irrigation. We have a river. We have a structure called the main outfall drain. Okay, and it's a structure that was built and designed and built to intercept drainage water from farms. This river is designed for 220 cubic meters per second. You know what 220 cubic meters? It's one of the biggest rivers in the world, right? 220 cubic meters, and that's just drainage water. So even the Iraqi engineers, the mindset of engineers basically was built on, we have so much water that we're going to continue using flood irrigation till infinity. Well, guess what? Things change, right? So what we need to do is to start thinking about modernizing irrigation. If we actually modernize irrigation, we can reduce demand on water by more than 50%, say 30%. That not solves the problem. It pushes the problem maybe 20 years down the line. Eventually, you have to understand that food is water. Without water, there is no food. A tomato is 95% water. And so water is life. Water is food. And if we want Iraq to become the breadbasket of the region, then we need to start understanding that water is not free.
And there is no water without wetlands. I think we have to move.
Thank you. Yes, and there's no biodiversity without wetlands. Yeah. I mean, look, when the marshes dried, what very few people understand, when the marshes dried for the 7 years that it dried between 1997 and 2003, it is documented that the shrimp catch in the Northern Gulf was reduced by 50%. Temperature in this region increased by 5 degrees centigrade. The number of sandstorms increased. The fish, I mean, even the. See, the thing is, people don't understand that nature. What What happens in the mountains of Kurdistan affects the marshes, and what happens in the marshes affects the northern Gulf. People don't understand that the Gulf salinity used to be 35,000 parts per million, very close to the salinity of oceans. 33,000 is the salinity of ocean. The Gulf salinity was 35,000 parts per million as recently as 1975. You know what it is today? 49,000 parts per million. In other words, it increased by 50% in the speed of 30 years. For thousands of years, for 13,000 years, the salinity of the Gulf was still, in 50 years, it goes from 33,000, 35,000 to 49,000. That is not what happened. The marshes dried, the water became controlled, no more water is coming to the Gulf. And you look at the Gulf, it's really an internal sea. There's only one connection called the Strait of Hormuz with the ocean. So there's no more circulation and there's no more water coming down the mountains. This is a great example of the connectivity of nature. We don't understand that the butterfly effect. You know, you've heard about the butterfly effect. Well, this is a brilliant example. 40 years, the ecology of the entire region is changing because mankind decided that we are smarter than nature. And we began building dams because, well, hell, you know, it's free electricity. Well, it is not free. Everything has a price.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that in the general discussion. And now we have to go on